The Voyages of the Kaimiloa, an Eruption short story by Doug Furr. The HHMS Kaimiloa was the flagship of the reformed Royal Hawaiian Navy from the time of her commandeering until her retirement in 2004. She began life as the USS California, CGN 36, originally commissioned into the U.S. Navy in 1974. Her service history with the U.S. Navy prior to December of 1985 was identical to that of the real world, including her circumnavigation of the globe in 1981. When Yellowstone erupted in December of 1985, she was ordered to set a course for Pearl Harbor and await further orders. The volcanic ash and dust in the atmosphere blacked out any further communications, and such orders never came. The San Diego Naval Mutiny began some 6 months later. Discipline had also begun to break down on many of the ships at anchor in Pearl Harbor, and the California was no exception. Many sailors simply deserted the ship as they wandered the streets of Honolulu in search of their next meal. When California declared independence on July 4th of 1986, many began to wonder if Hawaii might be next. The Navy placed all of its ships at anchor in Pearl under lockdown. No one was to be allowed off under any circumstances. The Pacific Fleet was also told to make ready to sail for the West Coast to put down the rebellion. Only the California, 2 destroyers, and 3 frigates were to remain to defend the islands. The fleet set sail in the wee hours of the morning on August 2nd. As soon as the ships disappeared over the horizon, a man wearing a traditional Hawaiian helmet and leading a detachment of Hawaiian National Guardsmen appeared on the pier where the California was moored. He introduced himself to the sentries as
the King of Hawaii, and we're here to restore our kingdom. I'd like to speak with the captain.
The starving crew of the California watched eagerly as the captain escorted the king up to the bridge. After being abandoned by the U.S. for over half a year, the sailors had been dreaming of some savior to deliver them from this hell. The king, in his freshly pressed suit and golden headdress, walked among them like a living god. The spirits of old Hawaii returned to claim what was rightfully theirs. The captain swore allegiance to the kingdom and pledged the fidelity of his ship and crew. One by one, all 500 remaining crewmen of the California bowed before the king and swore loyalty to the reborn kingdom. Of course, the name California would no longer do, so the king rechristened the ship HHMS Kaimiloa, explorer, literally one who seeks afar, after the former flagship of the old Royal Hawaiian Navy from back in the 1880s. Her crew immediately set to work repainting her hull with her new name. The stars and stripes were unceremoniously lowered and thrown into the harbor, and the Hawaiian state flag was raised in its place, along with the Jolly Roger as a show of solidarity with the other rebellions on the West Coast. She went to sea later that afternoon with the frigate HHMS Lahue, formerly USS Louis B. Puller, and the destroyer HHMS Hilo, formerly USS Cochrane, to patrol northeast of the islands in case the U.S. fleet turned around. The task force would be diverted west of Kauai the next morning to intercept several American stragglers arriving from Japan. The Hawaiians would be met by USS Preble, USS Schofield, and the oiler USNS Kawashiwi. The ships spent the next 3 days at battle stations, chasing each other around Kauai and Niihau. Outwardly, the crew of the Kaimiloa put on a brave face and were ready to open fire as soon as the order was given. Many sailors would later admit they couldn't bear the thought of potentially having to open fire on former comrades, though. Fortunately, the dreaded order never came, and the loyalist ships disengaged and sailed south for the Panama Canal. While Kaimiloa and her task group were chasing the Americans, a distress call came in from one of her atomic sister ships, the USS Arkansas. The Arkansas had originally left for California with the rest of the Pacific Fleet. However, a fire broke out in one of her electrical cabinets, and she was forced to turn around and head for Pearl Harbor. The other destroyer commandeered by the Hawaiians, HHMS Kona, formerly USS David R. Ray, sailed out to meet her. Kona delivered an ultimatum. She would only be allowed into Pearl Harbor if her crew swore loyalty to the king. Otherwise, they would be fired upon. The Arkansas's captain tried to order the ships to battle stations, only to find himself being tackled by the first lieutenant who hollered,
Are you nuts? No one on this damn ship is going to open fire on our friends. If we have to join the Hawaiians, then so be it.
A fracas broke out on the Arkansas's bridge, but eventually the mutineers were able to wrestle control of the ship, and the captain was confined to his quarters. The Arkansas surrendered peacefully and docked in Pearl for repairs. Most of her crew pledged allegiance to the kingdom, just like on the Kaimiloa, and the ship was rechristened HHMS Hawaii. After a brief return to Pearl Harbor, Kaimiloa, Hawaii, Lihue, and Hilo would set sail again, this time charting a course for Midway Atoll. They arrived to find the islands deserted. The U.S. Navy personnel and civilian staff had apparently been evacuated by the Kawashiwi. A small contingent of Hawaiian National Guardsmen landed on Sand Island and claimed the atoll for the kingdom. It was there that the Kaimiloa and her task group would also rendezvous with the California Navy's Tarawa Expeditionary Strike Group, led by the assault ship CNS Tarawa. Aboard was a motley force made up of the surviving Californian Marines who had not been killed during the siege of Camp Pendleton, eager to prove their loyalty and atone for the sins of their misguided brethren. The Californian and Hawaiian ships turned west and set a course for Guam. The combined fleet reached the Mariana Islands on the evening of September 24th. A few U.S. Air Force F-15s and F-4s were sent to meet them. Evidently, they were suffering from the same fatigue and lack of support as U.S. Air Force units were on the West Coast. The Californian Marine Corps Harriers and the strike group SAMs made quick work of them. The assault fleet responded by launching a salvo of Tomahawk missiles at Anderson Air Base and Guam Navy Base. Later that night, a pair of F-111s made a pass at the Hilo. One was dispatched via a SAM from the Kaimiloa, and the other was brought down by a lucky hit from the Hilo's 5-inch guns. Radio traffic intercepted from the island indicated civil unrest had broken out on the island following the Tomahawk strikes. And just like back east, many of the American service personnel were joining the rioters. Kaimiloa and Hawaii were within gun range of the north shore of the island as dawn broke on the morning of the 25th. They let fly several salvos at the air defenses on Anderson Air Base to make way for the Californian Harriers and helicopters from the strike group. When the Californian Marine aviators overflew the island, they found both the Navy base and the airfield already ablaze. Evidently, in a last act of defiance, the Loyalist Americans had decided it was better to torch the facilities than let them fall into separatist hands. The city streets had also turned to bedlam as both the civilian population and deserting Americans clashed with Loyalist forces and the police. The Loyalist tanks and APC crews were too concerned with the immediate threat of the rioters to look up. The CMC Harrier and Cobra pilots would refer to their sortie that morning as the Second Mariana Turkey Shoot or the Guam Plinking Run, due to the ease of destroying the American armor. When the Marines landed later that morning, they encountered no meaningful resistance from the Loyalists and were greeted as liberators by the civilians. The king himself flew out to the island the next day, where he would be joined by the captains of the Kaimiloa and the Tarawa as they paraded through the streets with the Marines. Children threw flowers before them, marching bands played, and people broke down in tears at the sight of a Polynesian leader. It seemed that liberation had finally come to the island after centuries of being colonial subjects. The Liberation Fleet turned southeast, where the scene was repeated in Samoa. When asked for comment by a local newspaper, the Kaimiloa's captain was quoted, "It's a great honor to be part of this mission of liberation, and I always love a parade." All joking aside, by the time the Hawaiians returned to Pearl Harbor, Kaimiloa had already earned the nickname the Freedom Ship. The Kaimiloa became the first Royal Hawaiian Navy vessel to be awarded the Royal Unit Citation for Gallantry, although it should be noted that all the other ships in the Liberation Fleet received it immediately after the Kaimiloa. She would spend the remainder of the 1980s and the year 1990 mostly sailing between the home islands, Samoa, and the Marianas. She did make several other visits to ports on the Pacific Rim to show the flag. The Philippines, Fiji, Tonga, and Majuro Atoll were all notable stops. At the end of 1990, she was placed under the command of Captain Gregory Quinton Hammersmith, Jr., An eccentric yet brilliant skipper, he was a self confessed Navy brat who had been born in Honolulu while his father, an accomplished naval aviator in his own right, was stationed there before moving to San Diego, where he would reside for most of his life, save for his time at the U.S. Naval Academy. He had also spent most of his career in the Navy serving on nuclear cruisers, so he was a natural choice for the job. He assumed command of the ship while she was in port, undergoing a minor upgrade to her fire control system to allow her to fire West Coast and Taiwanese produced versions of the SM-1 and SM-2. It is also believed that her electronic warfare suite was upgraded at this time as well, but the details have never been made public. She would be at sea en route to Guam on February 10th, 1991, when the American spy submarine Parchi was intercepted and sunk just off the coast of the Farallon Islands, the incident that would start the carrier war in the Pacific. The United States would declare unrestricted commerce rating rules to be in effect, and any ship flying under a separatist flag or sailing to a West Coast port would be fired upon. The USS Nimitz and her battle group were dispatched to the Pacific, along with an unknown number of attack submarines. To counter this threat, the West Coast and their new allies on the Pacific Rim resorted to using the convoy system, just like their fathers and grandfathers had done some 50 years earlier. Kaimiloa would play a major role in escorting these convoys, especially on the western leg of the route between Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hawaii. Once the merchants made it safely to Honolulu, they would be handed off to Californian Cascadian carrier groups led by the CNS California and the CNS San Diego for the eastern part of the journey to California. Kaimiloa would immediately turn around and head west with another convoy heading to Asia, sometimes having stopped in Honolulu for just a few hours, giving her just enough time to restock on food and the other conventionally powered escorts time to refuel. Captain Hammersmith always requested his ship sail at the head of the convoy, befitting of the flagship. He commissioned a giant battle ensign that flew proudly on her port side as soon as Kaimiloa was in formation with the convoy, so as to not interfere with her radar or flight operations. On her topmast, she flew a plain red flag, later replaced with a blood red Jolly Roger, indicating that no quarter would be given. While presented in a crass manner, the message was not untrue, as the convoy escorts were under strict orders not to break formation with the merchants and attempt rescue of downed American pilots. Kaimiloa's crew were usually careful to have the flag hidden when she was near port, though, as crowds of onlookers were always present pierside to catch a glimpse of the Freedom Ship. During her escort missions lasting from February to August, she would claim a total of 10 confirmed aerial kills, 6 aircraft and 4 missiles. However, only 8 of these could be confirmed. Her attached helicopter wing scored a torpedo hit on an American submarine, later identified as USS Sunfish. However, damage was minimal and the sub escaped. Kaimiloa's feats during the skirmish earned her the spurious nickname, the Carrier Killer, and her skipper became known as Hammerhead. When asked about it years later, Captain Hammersmith remarked,
When you're in the Navy, you'll eventually get given a nickname. It's just part of the culture. As long as it's not something too obscene, your best advice is to just embrace it, even if it's at your expense or it's not entirely accurate. Because if you make a big stink about it, you'll inevitably be christened with something much worse.
Kaimiloa was one of the ships escorting the convoy imported goods when the Soviet cruiser Admiral Fokin was struck by a rogue American harpoon missile. Some claimed it was the Kaimiloa's secretive electronic warfare system that spoofed the missile and sent it off course towards the Soviets. However, there is no way to prove this short of the Royal Hawaiian Navy declassifying the system. Regardless, Kaimiloa allegedly got revenge for the Fokin, as she is confirmed to have shot down an A-6 shortly after it allegedly fired the wayward harpoon. To clarify, the SM-2 hit on the A-6 was confirmed as coming from the Kaimiloa. However, whether or not this was the specific aircraft that fired the harpoon was not confirmed. This would be the final action the Kaimiloa would see during the carrier war, as the US and Soviets were talked down from the brink of nuclear war over the next few days, and American hostilities in the Pacific came to a close. For her service, Kaimiloa was again awarded the Royal Unit Citation, as well as Presidential Unit Citations from California, Cascadia, the Philippines, and Korea. In addition, all of her crew members were issued the Carrier War Service Medal, plus numerous additional individual medals. Captain Hammersmith himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. By the end of the Carrier War, it became clear that the Kaimiloa's reactors were in need of refueling and/or replacement. She had been in service for nearly 20 years now, and she was struggling to reach 30 knots, especially after her many trips across the Pacific. She pulled into Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in October of 1991 for refueling and refitting with the Joint Threat Upgrade Combat Suite. Given her status as the pride of the Royal Hawaiian Navy, she was given top priority and work was completed in January 1993. Captain Hammersmith once again took command as she set sail for her home of Pearl Harbor. After her homecoming and some more training cruises around the islands, Kaimiloa once again toured the Hawaiian territories. The remainder of the 90s was a much quieter time for Kaimiloa and her crew. Her most notable activities were returning to the allied nations of Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, as well as becoming the first ship from the West Coast to visit Australia and New Zealand after signing the Pacific Partnership Treaty. Captain Hammersmith would be promoted to Rear Admiral in 1996 and would be relieved by Captain Thomas Kuhio, notable for being of native Hawaiian ancestry. In 2001, Kaimiloa and Hawaii were joined by the first of a new generation of nuclear cruisers, Kamehameha I. These new cruisers use even more modern reactors than the upgraded Kaimiloa and Hawaii. Nuclear propulsion was chosen due to the cost of fuel in the island nation, and also featured the advanced Spy West phased array radar and the partnership combat system from the Californian Cascadian Siskiyou class conventionally powered cruiser, itself derived from the U.S. Navy's Ticonderoga class. Kaimiloa remained in active service until the arrival of the second new cruiser, HHMS Liliuokalani, in 2004, when she was placed in reserve status. Upon Liliuokalani's formal commissioning in August 1st, 2006, HHMS Kaimiloa was formally decommissioned after a combined 32 years of service. A grand ceremony was held at Pearl Harbor, at which all of her former crew members were invited, as well as the crews of the merchant ship she had protected during the Carrier War convoys, as many who could be located anyways. The Queen and now retired Rear Admiral Hammersmith both gave remarks saluting the Freedom ship and the brave sailors who served on her.
I can think of no finer ship, no finer sailors, and no finer cause than the freedom of the Pacific. I will be forever honored to have been her captain.
Kaimiloa was then towed into a dry dock at the Royal Hawaiian Navy Naval Shipyard. A team of reactor specialists from Puget Sound Naval Shipyard had been flown out to Pearl Harbor to remove the cores from Kaimiloa's reactors. Although the exact process remains a secret, it is known robots were used to remove the nuclear material and place it into storage casks for shipping. Most of the remaining reactor components and plumbing were then filled with concrete to entomb any remaining radioactive particles. The ship was declared denuclearized and towed across the harbor to the shore of Ford Island, just south of the wreck of the USS Arizona, where the USS Missouri is anchored in the real world. The HHMS Kaimiloa Freedom Ship Museum opened to the public some 6 months later in 2007. The museum is mostly focused on the ship's history in Hawaiian service, but it does make mention of some of her significant accomplishments in U.S. Navy service, such as her 1981 global circumnavigation and participation in Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee festivities. Many of the staff at the museum are actually former crew members, and Rear Admiral Hammersmith serves as the museum's executive director. Among the artifacts on display are the Battle Ensign and Jolly Roger flags the ship flew during the Carrier War, and the original memorandum signed by the governors of East Samoa and Guam, swearing fidelity to the kingdom. HHMS Hawaii remained in service until 2010 when the final Kamehameha I class cruiser was commissioned, HHMS Kaiulani. Hawaii also underwent nuclear defueling in Pearl Harbor before being towed all the way to Guam, where she was anchored at a specially constructed pier at the Royal Hawaiian Naval Base, where she became the central attraction at the HHMS Hawaii Freedom Ship Museum. The museum is operated as a branch of the original Freedom Ship Museum and is open to the public at least one weekend every month. Many have pointed out the younger Kaimiloa coincidentally shared many similarities with her predecessor. The original Kaimiloa had been purchased from the English as opposed to being built in Hawaii, similar to how the new ship was commandeered from the Americans. The younger Kaimiloa's voyages across the Pacific were also made in an attempt to unite the Polynesian cultures under the Hawaiian kingdom, which was King Kalakaua's original intent when he purchased the original ship and set sail in the 1880s. In doing so, war nearly broke out between Hawaii and several European colonial powers, not unlike modern Hawaii's conflicts with the US. Both Kaimiloas could also be considered steam powered, granted, the younger used nuclear power for generating steam. Last but not least, both Kaimiloas were outfitted with twin Gatling guns as part of their armament, the latter of which had them as part of her Sea Whiz batteries.